After the meeting was adjourned, Commissar Lucas made it a point to keep him in. Michael glanced uncertainly at Andrew, who looked at him with a wry smile, turned away, and Michael and Lucas were the only two left in the conference room. Lucas stared at Michael with a smirk. I heard you're taking care of one of the girls from the Foreign Office who came to military training. You've got your eye on her. Michael faded. No matter. Lucas doesn't believe me. That girl eats with you every day. She comes to you every day to mess with you, and you sent her to the infirmary, and you call that nothing? Michael's tongue topped his palate. These big old men, who do not know that they are idle, just a little thing, immediately spread 100,000 miles. The Lucas was aware of Michael's bit with Ivy, and if he'd known that the girl in the scandal was none other than the apple of John's eye, there's no telling how he would have reacted. Lucas suddenly said seriously, I heard that Ivy's girl is also in this military training team. You kid? A few years haven't forgotten to introduce you to other girls you don't want to, but now, how to get out of this kind of thing, I can tell you, in the end, no matter how. Don't have a problem with your personal style. I'm not sure if it's a good idea. Lucas is watching Michael grow up. This kid has been single all these years. He and the head of Rinbaugua also introduced a lot of girls to him, but he cannot see one. This time if it is also a happy thing, just how the two girls at the same time appeared here. Lucas, think about it, some headaches. Michael laughed and gave Lucas a proper military salute. Yes, Lucas waved, and Michael turned and headed out of the conference room. The conference room wasn't far from where he lived, a 10-minute walk away. The unit gave him a set of one-room house, although not large, but a person living is enough. He lives on that floor. A few days ago the light bulb is broken. The past few days a lot of things have not had time to change. He walked to the door in the dark, pulled out the key with one hand, and with the other took out a lighter and polished it. And with a mischievous flare of fire, the fire rose, a hand covered the back of Michael's hand, warm to the touch. Those years of exercise had sharpened his reflexes to such a degree that he was about to reach out and restrain the man, almost in an instant, but something seemed to flash in his mind in a flash of lightning, and he paused stiffly in his movements. Michael, not knowing what was in his heart, said, What are you doing here? A delicate female voice sounded in the darkness, and she gave a soft laugh. What do you think I'm doing here? Michael frowned in silence, and Ivy, as if she did not expect an answer from him either, said in a low voice, I came to molest you, half jokingly, brutally simple. Before uttering the words, Ivy thought of all kinds of reactions from Michael, storming off or coldly pushing her away. But she never expected Michael to move quickly and grab her other hand, bring both of her hands together into one and raise them above her head, and before she could react, her whole body was pressed against the wall by him. Michael's heart exploded with a thud as if oil had been poured on it, and he was furious and angry. We haven't seen each other for 3 years. I don't know who this little girl has learned from. Blocking the doorway of a big man like him 3 times, he approached her with an air of danger, and Ivy could clearly feel Michael's hot breath, mingled with anger, spewing over her head. He said, almost through clenched teeth, It's just as well, I want to tune you up, too. Ivy was suddenly afraid. She had dared to act out in front of Michael, but only because he favored her. However, today he was like this, greatly out of her expectation. In a moment she struggled violently, and Michael's hands were like chains, binding her wrists so tightly that they were raw, and no matter how much she moved, he didn't budge. He doesn't favor her anymore. He really doesn't, and doesn't care half as much about her feelings. That Ivy suddenly fell into a deep despair, and her struggles abated. A hot touch covered her lips, and Ivy knew that it was Michael's lips that without mercy he tore at her lips. Unlike the kisses of the past, when the two of them were in love, Ivy was feeling 100,000 pangs of aggravation at Michael's unemotional gestures, but even more painful than the touch was her heart, and she felt the pain of the kiss. Her initiative and cheeklessness were all part of a fear that if she didn't try a little harder there really wasn't the slightest possibility of anything happening between them. But it wasn't actions like hers that made him think that she was a woman who could be made to do whatever she wanted to do. And how many such women have thrown themselves at him in the last 3 years, and has he been so forthcoming? And once upon a time, Ivy had never thought about these things, and had never doubted Michael, but now it seemed that it was she who had been too confident that his feelings for her had perhaps, like the 3 years that had flown by, the blossoming of flowers, long since lost with them. The previous self-confidence was like a total defeat in this moment, a collapse of 1,000 miles. Ivy suddenly felt like a joke, she closed her eyes and wondered, heartbreakingly, if she hadn't gone far away out of cowardice, would everything be different now? Michael was really angry in his heart that Ivy was leaving when she said she would, coming when she said she would, and doing whatever she wanted based on his feelings for her. But even if he did, what could he do about it? He examined his heart. He loved her. And had loved her, and was, and would love her, and from the time she was young, to the time she was in her prime, and perhaps to the time she was gray, there was no way in which he could ever give up the girl completely. Her lips were warm and sweet, still mesmerizing him. He freed one of his hands and took hold of her not-so-small waist, and in the darkness he could not see Ivy's eyes, but her watery eyes had been imprinted on his heart. He kissed her negatively. He didn't want to kiss her in this situation, he just wanted her to know it hurt. But gradually he lost himself in the kiss. It wasn't until his lips were salty that Michael reacted to the fact that it was her tears that were dripping down his lips. This is the girl on the tip of his heart. Ah, a drop of her tears can make the heart of this man, who does not even feel pain when he is shot, tighten up. He could not spare her a touch more, and he released her gently, even a little handily. Except that in the darkness, Ivy couldn't see him move like that. He let himself be quiet, his tone tinged with annoyance and coldness. Ivy, jokes like that, don't just make them in the future. Ivy froze in the darkness. She hadn't expected him to let go of her like that, the way he just moved, so roughly, so angrily, and with such impatience. Clearly her heart panicked, and she didn't know whether to be thankful or sad that between those movements just now, Michael's lighter fell to the floor. He didn't bother to pick it up. He re-pulled out the key in the pitch blackness, moved to insert it sharply into the keyhole and turn it, opened the door, and without waiting for Ivy to respond, slamming the door behind her. Ivy was left alone in the darkened hallway, twiddling her thumbs more and more helplessly. How did that happen? How did that happen? Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. Was there really not the slightest possibility? But she distinctly felt, in his rough movements, that there was such a trace of reluctance. Ivy just stood in the doorway weeping silently. How she wished that person would open the door and tell her that she was just being annoyed with her, yet the door stayed closed tightly, like the material it was made of, radiating cold. And she didn't know how long she cried in the doorway, and when she got tired of crying, she muddled downstairs, and Michael stood in the door, hearing Ivy's wailing sobs, and he didn't even dare to move a muscle. He was afraid that if he moved, he wouldn't be able to resist rushing out to hug her, to comfort her, to tell her to stop crying, but he can't always give in to this haughty girl. She always needs to suffer something, so that she won't learn from her mistakes and always do unreliable things. I don't know how long Ivy had been crying, but Michael finally heard the sound of tiny, broken footsteps heading downstairs. At the moment it is already midnight, although there are street lamps in the camp, but after all, in the mountains, the light is very weak. I do not know if the girl will be afraid on the way back. Well, here is the territory of the army. There are no idle people, her personal safety can be guaranteed. Ivy. Ivy. Michael pronounced Ivy's name, the only one that could tug at his heartstrings so easily. He didn't turn on the lights, and sat quietly in the house, but all he could think of was her. He took out his cell phone, which glowed with a glowing blue light in the darkened room, and dialed the soldier who was on duty, and the call was immediately picked up by the Michael's got a mission over there. 20 minutes to bed check for MFA military trainees. He's moved to selfishness. After all. A short while later, the other side called him back, saying that the 3 squad leaders had returned from their bed check, and that there was nothing out of the ordinary. Michael knew that Ivy must have gone back, and his heart finally dropped. Grace messaged him on WeChat. That day Grace had come to the troop to bring him soup had been unexpected. When Grace went back, Michael thought he'd made it clear enough to her that he did not look at the specifics of what Grace sent him, clicked on Grace's avatar, deleted all the messages she sent him. He did not pull the plug on her. It was in the way of the face of the older generation. But also because at first he promised the old man, if she had any difficulties, he would definitely help. With Grace, however, he was indeed not the least bit moved. The time of military training is long, but also fast. After a few days is the last subject of military training, the field exercise, troops in the polling exercise, easily 50 or 60 kilometers, but also carrying dozens of kilograms of heavy bags, to the most rugged mountain roads. The other day, Lucas came to give Michael the slip, and the head of the Foreign Office came to whine to him that Michael, the chief, instructor, had practiced the little girl children of the Foreign Office hard enough. Lucas gave Michael 3 orders to cut the Foreign Office group of military trainees some slack on this last subject. The chief's face must always be given, not to mention the fact that the cadets of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs had far exceeded Michael's expectations in their military training performance. The preset marching route of the polling exercise was cut to half, the obstacles and sneak attacks were much less. The original length of the polling exercise of 7 days was shortened to 3 days, and the so-called weight-bearing was only carried on the backs of bedding, kettles, and other necessities, meaning that Michael, as the main instructor of this military training, coordinating the whole process of military training, but on weekdays he has other tasks, and not often with the foreign ministry trainees in a piece. The specific subjects are carried out by the 3 class leaders, Jack, Oliver, and Ethan. The 3-day pullout, and Michael just happened to be free. 2. To take a moment to finish the subject with them, the breaking it down. This is the first subject Michael has completed with the cadets the entire time since the beginning of his military training. The only one who wasn't excited about it was probably Ivy. After what had happened the other day, she got a little squeamish whenever she saw Michael, and Michael looks handsome in the crowd is very out of the ordinary. A training camouflage uniform, more appear to be his posture straight, all righteousness. When the cadets first came to the troop, many of the girls were attracted to the master instructor, who, unfortunately, had always been a busy man, and seldom appeared, but every time he did he caused a commotion. Suddenly learned that Michael will be with them to complete the last subject, the girls not to mention how excited, but the male trainees are a little depressed. The main instructor is quite handsome, but handsome and cannot be eaten. Michael every time he appeared on the face, not less than to make these trainees suffer. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs to recruit is to pick the looks of the ministry of the group of young people think that they are good looking, but when it comes to Michael, all of them lost their colors, and they are all angry in their hearts, so it's strange that they can like Michael. The difficulty of the stretch has been deliberately lowered, but it's still tough for a bunch of cadets in the ministry. That at the beginning of the exercise, there was a distance of nearly 10 kilometers to be covered. And the 3 squad leaders had maps in their hands that had been surveyed in advance, and they had to arrive at the positions specified. On the maps Michael followed them along, and by all rights, a lead instructor like Michael would have been perfectly capable of waiting for them at the established location of for the first time in the mountains. The people look at everything fresh. Usually this group of them were locked in the camp's training ground, training for a long time. It is inevitable to feel dull and boring, this moment just into the mountains. Although they know what awaits them, but still full of novelty, the beautiful scenery of the mountains and the chirping of birds, the trainees are jumping for joy. The sun was out today, and the hint of autumn wind in the mountains was still cool, and the pace at first was not fast, just normal weighted walking, and the people felt in a trance that they had come to trek in the fall. But after a short while of relaxation, the pace of the group began to pick up. The mountain road is rugged, turning one corner after another, climbing and descending, and carrying the daily necessities on their backs. Before they set foot on campus, the most they did on weekdays was just to carry a backpack to the library to study, or take a book to go outside to read in the morning, and the most they did was to go to the library to study, or take a book to go outside to read in the morning. Such a load was not difficult for them, and by the time they had climbed yet another hill, several of them were already panting and unable to keep up. Michael motioned for the 3 squad leaders to continue on with the others, while he himself approached those who had fallen behind. The guys had completely lost their energy, some of them simply sat on their asses on the grass. Michael walked up to them and looked down on them, and unlike what they expected, there was some concern in Michael's tone. Why don't you go? And they were really not in good physical condition, and felt that today's training was even more horrible than usual, and for a moment they held the mentality of taking down their burdens, and did not care how strict Michael was usually, and said bluntly, "Michael, it was just too tiring to walk," and they thought they would usher in Michael a burst of unrelenting admonition, but did not expect. Michael looked at the wristwatch, and spread out the hands of the map to see, advised, "There are still 4 kilometers to the place where you can be stationed. Walking in front of the people are also tired, you and they are now comrades in arms, tomorrow walked to the diplomatic occasions. Is a colleague of the coworkers, each of your choices and your collective are closely related to you. Are you sure you want to be the one who runs away from the battlefield, Michael did not say a single heavy word. He understood that the military training had reached this last level, both physically and psychologically. The crowd was exhausted, and the test for them had reached its peak. In the past, when training new recruits, Michael had been tough on them but extremely loving. And if the cadets who had fallen behind had really been physically limited in any way, he would never have let them go on any further. But judging by Michael's experience, they were now only feeling physically tired because they usually trained less, and there was no physical defect that prevented them from continuing. It would not be ashamed to give up so lightly, both for the main instructor of the force, who was as strict as Michael, and for them to recall the experience of this military training later on. The trainees were a little shaken in their minds when they heard Michael's words. Some of them could have chosen a higher-paying job, but the family and national sentiments held in their hearts made them enter such a department, while today they have to give up because of a little difficulty, which is indeed inconsistent with the sentiments in their hearts. Michael let them think for a moment, and immediately afterwards said, "Take a 5-minute break, get some water, and I'll walk with you." A few people who had wilted a second ago were instantly resurrected like chicken blood, and said in unison, "Yes, a few kilometers is not long, but this is a mountain road, and not good, and they also have a load, and before they have walked 5 or 6 kilometers, the next road." Feel the strain of the people more and more. When Ivy was in Afghanistan, because of her work, she was often so busy all day that she didn't even take a break, but carrying things on her back and not being able to take a break from walking up a 10-kilometer mountain road was a bit tough for her. Ivy kept gritting her teeth and moving forward. The sun was getting higher and higher overhead. The sun was shaking her eyes. She felt her eyes burning. The skin on her face was on fire. Her head was a little dizzy. Her ears were buzzing, and it was suddenly dark before her eyes. The Ivy couldn't control herself anymore. She swayed twice, fell backwards. Aunt Simeon and Sophia had been next to her, but both were also dizzy from the sun, so they didn't react in time when Ivy fell toward the back of the room. A dark green figure ran over like a speedy wind, and the crowd couldn't even see his movements before the man had Ivy in his arms. Michael was half crouching, and Ivy was held steady in the crook of his arm. She was as petite as a cat, and he dared not exert himself, or let go of her. She's so strong. So strong it hurts him. The gang, who had just yelled that they couldn't go on, now followed him to catch up with the brigade, but Ivy, who had been following the brigade, collapsed and Michael's hands went to work, holding down her manhood, his voice anxious. "Ivy." There was no response from the man in his arms, and he pinched twice more, hard, while shouting, "Jack, glucose." Yes, Jack saw the commotion over here and came running from a short distance away. Immediately pulling out his carry-on bag and pulling out glucose, Michael took it quickly, immediately breaking Ivy's mouth open and pouring it into her mouth. Ivy's bleak lips finally regained some blood color, and her body moved slightly. Michael's voice is soft as he calls her name, "Ivy." July. Ivy had been able to hear Michael's voice and feel the strong arms he had wrapped around her. She wanted to make a sound, but she was so tired she found it very hard to even agree with him. The troops training recruits often encounter such a situation: too much exercise, the weather is hot, hypoglycemia plus heatstroke. Dealing with such things, Michael and several squad leaders are familiar with. Make up some glucose, saline, and then let the person rest for a while. Really cannot be, then sent to the infirmary. Generally will not have a problem, but Ivy was like this, and Michael, who was calm as usual, was actually in a state of shock. Ivy moved the corners of her mouth and finally hummed softly, her sanity finally coming back, but the whole thing was very weak. She looked at Michael with some confusion, and some lack of energy, and Michael asked her if she could hold on. Though he was a man who treated his work meticulously, he now had a selfish wish that she would say no, and he would send her back at once. Ivy was giddy, and she turned her head, looking at the people surrounding her. Everyone's gazes were filled with vague concern, and of course, there was Xingyu, who seemed to have some disdain in her gaze. Ivy thought about it, bit the corner of her mouth, and nodded firmly. "I can do that." Michael frowned habitually, as if to chide her for fooling around, for not trying to be brave. Ivy had not the strength to fool with him, nor the spirit to stab him deliberately, but only to say that my comrades and I were one, and that we were going to accomplish our mission together, and that I could not give it up because of the slightest problem. Michael was dumbfounded. He rose with a jerk, and Ivy was pulled to her feet, and there was another dizzying flash. And in a flash of lightning she was on his back. The ivy shuddered with fear and there were exclamations of surprise all around her, and before Ivy could ponder the implications of those sounds, she was already being carried forward on Michael's back. Mian, who followed behind, suddenly got excited and poked Sophia with some gossipy energy. "Look, it's a real match." Sophia smiled without saying a word. The other cadets reacted in different ways. Some had even brainstormed a barracks love story that Master Instructor Michael and Prickly Ivy had to tell. The ivy lay on Michael's back, suddenly thinking that the last time might not have been as bad as she thought. She rested her head gently on Michael's shoulder, which was broad and strong, and how he leaned on it was solid, and her voice was soft, like a gust of wind. "Don't you want to put me down?" Michael grunted. "Put it down for what?" "Put it down so you can screw things up for me." Fainting like that Ivy hadn't thought would happen, and objectively it did add to everyone's problems, and even more to Michael's. "It's not good for you to go behind my back like this. People will misunderstand our relationship." Such a pulling exercise was but a trifle for Michael. His stamina was much better than the crowd. Even with Ivy on his back, his feet flew, and he instantly walked to the front of the crowd of trainees. Their voices were so low that no one could hear what the two of them were actually muttering about. Michael snorted with derision in his voice, overthinking the unsure. Ivy rubbed her head against his shoulder and Michael gave a start. And from his lips he squeezed out two words: "Comrade in arms." Ivy didn't say a word. She lay quietly on Michael's shoulder. Let him be. A comrade in arms is a comrade in arms. She was suddenly glad that she had just fainted to have this brief and intimate moment with Michael, and now she didn't want to think about anything but lying on his shoulder, just slowly letting time flow by. And more than 2 hours later, a group of cadets finally arrived at the stationing place one after another. Such a speed! If it was put in the new recruits, one did not reach Michael's requirements, though luckily, they all persevered and none of them were left behind. Political Commissar Lucas had asked Michael 1,000 times before to keep his demands on them low during the pullout, and Michael had agreed, and now had fulfilled his account. The 3 squad leaders commanded the cadets to place their loads in specific locations, and the crowd neatly arranged their backpacks, and then dug holes in the ground with military shovels, built fires, and cooked under the command of the squad leaders. The trainees were rejuvenated. They had never cooked like this before, and they were all very active as if they had discovered a new continent. Ivy also curious. Earlier she saw a few male colleagues in the ministry don't know what they were holding. At this moment, once the cloth on top of that thing was lifted, it was actually a huge pot. She had been sitting on the sidelines watching, but now she couldn't hold back her curiosity, and moved her feet to stand up and get a hand. Ivy was just about to get up when she was pressed on the shoulder, and Michael said, with some tone of disgust, and the strength to move blindly. "I just wanted to see," Ivy said in a low voice. "It won't do to watch it here," Michael said, with a stern face. Ivy took one look at his serious demeanor and had to stop. "She's watching from afar." The smoke curled up. The people set up the pot, so big pot naturally cannot use a spatula. Pour all kinds of ingredients in, with a clean military spatula in the inside stirring. Ivy suddenly let out a soft laugh and stretched out her index finger to point at Michael's chest. "Chief, your equipment doesn't work." "Ah." Michael didn't understand, just looked up at her lazily, and Ivy winked at him playfully, and nudged her mouth again to show him what the military shovel was being used for. Michael laughed softly and unexpectedly. "You're the one who has a lot on your plate. It's called a shovel." When he finished, he seriously scrutinized Ivy's face. "You've slowed down. You dare to pick a fight in front of me." Her watery eyes were clear and bright, her eyes were spinning, and she didn't know how many bad ideas were loaded in them, and she was simply a different person from the weak one just now. Ivy winked smartly. It was okay. She suddenly turned sideways and leaned over to Michael's side. In fact, the two didn't sit too close together. There was about half a meter in between, but when she leaned over like this, the distance between them suddenly closed, almost face to face. She whispered, "There is a saying that the scourge will last 1,000 years. Hasn't the chief heard of it?" Ivy was so close he could see the tiny fluffy hairs on her face. The girl was being fancy again. Michael stood up with a sharp flash of expressionlessness, not wishing to continue the subject with Ivy, and said aloud, "Let's go. It's time for dinner." The crowd had expended too much physical energy earlier, and although the cauldron of food did not taste good, they still ate incredibly well. After the meal, Michael gave the crowd a 20-minute break, and began the afternoon stretch again. I do not know whether it is because they have just rested, or have been marching all morning. Accustomed to such a pattern, the crowd in the afternoon training to go much smoother, even if they are walking slowly, fell out of the line, but just rest for a while, and then catch up with the army. After walking for an afternoon, the cadets conversely became more and more energetic, as if the pulling exercise wasn't so difficult, but just when they thought so. The 3 squad leaders suddenly told them that this section was going to be a running attack, before the training to run. 3 kilometers let these trainees feel tired enough, but now they have to run 6 or 7 kilometers with a backpack. The trainees screamed bitterly, though they muttered and grumbled on their lips, their steps could not be stopped, and the group ran forward, gasping for breath. Aunt Sophia looks worriedly at Ivy. Ivy, are you okay with this? Ivy had fainted during the morning stretch and continued to persevere for such a long walk in the afternoon that it was hard to let go of her. Ivy nodded, gritted her teeth, and ran forward, following the crowd's lead. Not far away there was a dense forest, such a wilderness that no one came to take care of the woods at all. Going through these woods, several cadets got hung up on branches while walking through this dense forest. Their backpacks got hooked on branches, and cadets who were close enough to help the entangled cadets cut the branches. Xingyu was also hung up by the branch. She struggled hard twice, but did not break away. That action is still a bit funny. The 3 of them, Ivy, Sophia, and Su Mian, were walking right behind Xingyu. Seeing Xingyu in such a state, Ivy didn't even think twice before stepping forward to help her, and the cadets each brought a saber. Ivy picked up the knife on her body to help Xingyu cut those branches. Ivy's hand only raised up. Xingyu loudly rebuked her, "You do not move me." The Sojetsu had been hostile to Ivy for a long time, and Ivy had seen it coming for a long time. Their unit is full of smart people. Who generally do not show too obvious, like Xingyu, such as the first one. Ivy's tone is flat. "You're in my way." With that she raised her hand and swiftly cut a branch that was wrapped around Xingyu's backpack. Their conversation was overheard by those around them, and whoever it was, let out a snort. Xingyu immediately turned red, struggled a few times, but her backpack was wrapped tightly around the branches of the tree, and she could not escape. Ivy also laughed softly, her hand movements became more skillful, and Su Mian and Sophia also stepped forward to help. Within a few moments, those branches that were entangled in Xingyu's baggage were cut down as much as possible. Xingyu could finally move. She turned back and fiercely gouged out Ivy, gritted her teeth and said, "Meddling in other people's business," and then smothered her head, and rushed forward alone. After another hour or so of forward travel, it was completely dark, and Michael told the squad leaders to notify the cadets to arrive at the location where they would be stationed for the night. The evening was different from noon, when there was only a short rest, but this evening they were to pitch their tents and spend the whole night in this wider area of small gentle slopes. Tenting this kind of thing, but it is difficult to a group of female cadets. Fortunately, Michael did not say they cannot help each other, so we are men and women match. A few groups will soon be. The tent is set up. And then there was the fire and the cooking, and this time there was no one to stop Ivy from joining the cooking crew. Cooking in the wilderness looks like it's pretty easy and rough, and it feels like you just have to cut everything up, put it in a pot and stir it up, and then you're ready to eat it. But Ivy didn't realize until she actually experienced it that the military spatula, which was proportional to the size of the pot, was a struggle for her just to lift. After a few moments of struggling to stir blindly, Ivy's bare forehead was already covered with fine beads of sweat, and her hands were too sore to lift them. Michael had been sitting with the 3 squad leaders. Jack, they were grabbing Michael to ask what to do to get into the special brigade thing. Suddenly saw Michael's eyes coldly looking to the side of the fire cooking. They followed Michael's gaze over. Is not it the prick Ivy.to say is also strange, obviously in the whole military training process, with their chief of staff is the most wrong Ivy, but this morning an Ivy fainted. A few of them close to the people actually saw their chief of staff face flashed a hint of panic. Just the 3 small squad leaders are rash, did not think about it at all. Jack at this time saw Michael look at Ivy like this. Just think, Michael is not used to seeing Ivy cooking look, and quickly rushed to Ivy's side. From Ivy hand on the spatula snatched over. You rest, I'll, the young squad leader got along with Ivy quite well in private, so Ivy didn't treat him politely, and handed him the shovel. Here. The cold meaning in Michael's eyes finally eased a bit when he saw Ivy hand over the items in her hand to Jack and walk aside to sit down on the grass herself. Vain his heart, he thought, Jack, this kid is quite clever, cannot enter the special brigade to say, but at least to engage in the logistics of this piece is a top one of the good hand. This is also considered to be found in Jack's advantage. Jack, who was cooking hard, would never have guessed that he'd gotten into Michael's good graces. Ethan and Oliver were still pestering Michael with questions about the Special Brigade, and Michael gave each of the two a smack in the face for not practicing the basics. Dream on, the two cried and mourned, thinking that this is over. The military school is unable to test into the Special Brigade's success is also hopeless, and then wait for a year of compulsory military service period is over. Can only pack up things to go home. Michael sent the blubbering Oliver to fetch Ivy and Xingyu over, and when the two had come over, Michael led them off to the other side, away from the encamped crowd. He had not yet spoken, but solemnity was written all over his face. The what happened in the woods this afternoon, who said. Ivy had little expression, a look of unconcern. Xingyu reddened, moreover, she did not want to mention it, and Michael's fiery eyes. What can there be along the way that he doesn't know? All these grudges of the cadets he's seen and remembered, not to mention the ones related to Ivy. In the end, it was Xingyu who couldn't hold it in and choked out the story. Michael nodded thoughtfully as he listened, resumed lifting his long, slender forefinger and pointing at Ivy. Oh, she helped you, and you. As he spoke, he turned his head toward Xingyu again, and Xingyu was in the wrong, but she was as aggrieved as if she was the one who was hurt, with tears in her eyes. She just didn't say anything. Michael's voice was low, but with a few thinly veiled hints of anger, and he apologized to Ivy. The Xingyu's ears were red with anger, and she watched as the word no was about to come out of Michael's mouth, and without waiting for her to say it, Michael gulped, apologized, and don't make me say it again, forced by Michael's pressure. So Jetsu reluctantly turned to Ivy with some twang in his tone and said, I'm sorry. Ivy hurriedly waved her hand. It wasn't that she was polite with Xingyu, it was that she didn't want to get too involved with Xingyu at all. No need. The matter was settled. Michael also did not forget to say with some knocking tone, you are here one day is my soldiers. I have to my soldiers what is required. I believe that you are also clear. This kind of thing I do not want to happen again. Although the words were said to the two men, but Michael's words are clearly meant to be, Xingyu did not dare to refute, but the heart has been very bad taste. The mountain breeze at night carried a slight coolness, and the group built a campfire in the mountains, where the squad leaders led the cadets in singing military songs, one after another. The atmosphere became lighter, and some participants even took the initiative to show their talents. I don't know who yelled and said, Michael, do one of these. 2.at those words. Everyone swished their eyes to Michael, who was sitting off to the side of the room. Michael's brow was handsome and rigid, and even after a full day of pulling, there was little fatigue in his face. At the moment, sitting with the crowd, he was less stern, and more affable. Facing the crowd's warm gaze, Michael seemed unfeeling, only his eyes fell on Ivy if anything, and then spoke. My songs are for one person only. As the words fell, there was a commotion in the crowd, all discussing who the man was. A male cadet's voice came from the crowd. Stupid, it's Michael's girlfriend. Ivy didn't listen to their discussion, except that her heart felt as if it had been hammered when Michael uttered the words. Her whole body felt like a surge of electricity, and suddenly she shuddered. And Michael says he sings his songs to only one person. That guy. Ivy doesn't even dare to think that Michael used to have to confiscate his cell phone when he went to military school. At one point, Michael didn't contact her for 2 weeks. At that point, she was ruminating on why he hadn't contacted her, if he'd met some other girl at school. Then, when she finally got a call from Michael, he told her that all of them had had their communications equipment confiscated due to training requirements, but said nothing about what that training of his was. She didn't know any better, but she didn't ask a word about it. That's when he told her he'd learned a new army song and wanted to sing it to her. Ivy opened her mouth to say yes, and Michael's magnetic voice rang out over the phone, and even though it was thousands of miles away, she still felt like he was right there with her. And the song was called Green Flowers of the Army, and when he sang of a good girl in my hometown, of whom I have often dreamed, she wondered if she had misheard him, and seemed to feel a lump in his throat. And they grew up together. It was the first and only time she ever heard him sing. Ivy was still lost in her own memories, and the crowd was still stirring, and the campfire crackled with a rustling sound came from the forest behind them, but no one noticed that suddenly, several black figures rushed into their midst, and everything happened so fast that the cadets, who were still heckling, couldn't react in time. before several of them were taken captive by the black-robed men who broke in and ran towards the dense forest. The people suddenly remembered the squad leaders gave them a precautionary shot before the stretching exercise, saying that some special circumstances would occur on the way to the stretching exercise, and that at that time they would have to look at the response of each of them, which would be scored and fed back to the ministry. They know that the whole process of military training is scoring, and that when the ministry assigns new entrants to the ministry at the end of the training, they are considered on the basis of the scores they have received during the training and their specialties in different aspects of the training. The day's stretching went quite well, so much so that many cadets let their guard down, thinking that the so-called stretching was just a loaded walk and run, followed by a potpourri and a military song, and then it was over. The trainees suddenly panicked when they encountered such an unexpected situation. The female trainees screamed, the male trainees were at a loss for words, and after a few dozen seconds, a few fast reactors finally took countermeasures and caught up with the men in black to tangle with them to free the kidnapped trainees. However, a group of people in such a tense moment simply do not remember a few squad leaders to teach them those close combat techniques, only by instinct to the black-clothed people and pounding and beating, but those black-clothed people as steel. Not the slightest move. Also, how could their gang be the opponent of those men in black? Those men in black, originally an important part of their polling training, all prearranged, playing the men in black are soldiers in the army. How could they beat? It was a very confusing scene for a while. Ivy joins in to free her comrades. On her side, the one who was kidnapped was Su Mian, and several female trainees who were close to Su Mian were tearing at the black-cloaked men, trying to snatch Su Mian back. But the person who tied up Su Mian is male, tall, and military. There are a few female trainees can't defeat them at all. Ivy was backed up a few steps by the man in black's backhand, and she was about to go up again when she suddenly saw a couple of men in black in the distance actually running towards Michael. The Michael is only one person, and there are 3 people running towards him. All 3 people are very fast, in the blink of an eye in front of Michael. With Michael entangled in a fight, Ivy's mind went blank, and without even thinking about it, she fought her way to Michael's side of the room. The pockets of the uniform contained sabers, and Ivy slipped one hand into her own pocket, drew it, and raised it at the man whose back was turned to her and who was struggling with Michael. The man seemed to feel Ivy's hand and the sudden wind brought up by the knife swinging in midair, and dodged over with a sharp dodge, and Ivy raised her hand again, and pursued the man, as if with a monstrous rage. And Michael suddenly reached out and took Ivy's arm in his, and knocked gently on it. He used such dexterity that Ivy didn't feel any pain in her wrist, but the knife in her hand fell to the ground, and plunged straight into the dirt. The 3 men in black who had attacked Michael took their masks off, and one of the faces that came into view was very familiar, and Ivy thought for a moment, suddenly surprised. Liam, said Liam was a member of the Special Assault Brigade, mainly sniping. And Ivy had met him during the evacuation in Afghanistan. The situation just now shocked Ivy out of a cold sweat. She simply forgot that this is just a mission arranged on the way to test them. When Michael was in danger, she even forgot that she is just a weak woman, and did not hesitate to choose to help Michael. Liam raised an eyebrow and smiled at Ivy. I mean, Ivy, you're hitting it a little too hard. There was no plan for them to attack Michael, they were just trying to get through to him, but they didn't know that a girl would come out to save Michael. Ivy was rather embarrassed by Liam's comment. It's all because you guys, Michael, taught her so well. Liam raised an eyebrow and looked at Michael and whistled, taking after him, all because Michael had taught him well. When he was in Afghanistan, he realized that Michael and Ivy seemed to have some sort of entanglement. Michael didn't bother with Liam, just instructed him to take the men back. They stopped on their side, and the rest of the men in black stopped, and this time, the people Michael arranged for the night attack were members of the Special Brigade, not to mention this group of cadets. It would be difficult for second-year soldiers like Jack and the others to try to retrieve the cadets who had been pulled away from them. Michael is testing everyone's alertness and response in the face of the unexpected, and it's clear that the vast majority of them are letting Michael down. After a false alarm, Michael had the crowd assemble in a full line, and the training is to bring you out to sharpen your skills, not to let you come to the mountains for a picnic. When you encounter an emergency situation, this is how you deal with it. Where are the things that your squad leader usually teaches you? Ivy had seldom seen Michael like this, either when they were together before, or since returning from Afghanistan. He must have experienced countless lives and deaths, so in every training session of the trainees, he had almost harsh requirements for every detail, because he knew that every laziness in training would be a fatal omission in the actual combat later on. Such a Michael enabled her to appreciate the sanctity of his profession all the more, that he was a true and iron soldier, that at the beginning of the second day's polling exercise, everyone was in high spirits, fearing that there would be another unexpected situation. Luckily, the ride was pretty smooth. By noon, the 3 squad leaders had broken up the 3 squads into groups of 5 men and women, with each group getting 1 map, and the afternoon pullout was to arrive at a designated place to set up camp by 8 p.m., according to the coordinate points indicated on the map. Ivy, Sumian and Sophia and the 2 boys, Daniel and Anthony, were grouped together. How to use a map. It's a subject they've learned before. Ivy and Sophia are fine, more or less can read a little, Sumian cannot, completely unable to distinguish the southeast, northwest and north, and such a map, as long as the wrong one coordinate grid, it is a fallacy of 10 miles, and the map will not be able to tell the difference. Boys seem to be a little more sensitive to this kind of stuff, and both Anthony and Daniel had done pretty well in their previous training in this subject, especially Daniel, who was an outdoorsman himself, so he was kind of familiar with reading maps. So the 5 set out, Daniel in the lead, with the map in hand. Each of their groups was assigned a different map, and although the final location to be reached was uniform, the routes on the maps were different, that they only need to follow the route on the map to get there without any problems, or of course not follow the route on the map, but make sure that they can get to the set location. When Michael set up this polling program, it was unanimously opposed by Political Commissar Lucas and Regimental Commander Renbaugua, who argued that it was too risky and that cadets could easily get lost in the mountains. Michael felt that the program would be helpful in their future work, insisted on retaining it, and made good on it. Because of Daniel, Ivy and her group had it very easy. One section of their route takes them along a river, which is kind of a more obvious landmark. That the autumn riverside, beautiful scenery, the leaves have turned golden yellow, have fallen, a few people walk unhurriedly. Do not say it really is a bit like the meaning of the autumn tour. This mood cannot let Michael know, after walking along the river for a while, and turning toward the right bank of the river, and going into a mountain. Daniel looked at the map and told the group that they just had to go over this mountain, reach the bottom of the valley, and then go up to the top of another mountain, which was where they would be stationed for the night. That they were absolutely on board with Daniel's strength, and just followed him. The way up was very laborious, and several of the men were out of breath from the climb, when at last they reached the top of the hill, and could see far enough to see the summit of the mountain opposite, which was so gentle that it looked as if they should be going to camp in that very place. A group of people heading for a valley between 2 mountains, green grass in the valleys, and sheep grazing. The local farmers warmly greeted them, and came to practice again. It looks like Michael and his unit come over here to stretch out from time to time. The other party didn't notice anything wrong with the composition of the group, and they didn't say much, just smiled at each other in a friendly way. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and Daniel estimated that, at this rate, they would be sure to arrive within the time allotted for this progress is not bad. The group talked and laughed up from the valley and then climbed up another mountain, also feel not so difficult. Even the hobby of outdoor sports. Daniel also walk, while teaching everyone to identify the various plants in the mountains. This is the half-summers can be used as medicine, this is the root of the bluebells. That there was adoration written all over Sumi's gaze as she looked at Daniel. That at 7 o'clock in the evening, Ivy's group reached the top of the hill, and the other groups had not yet come, and they were, surprisingly, the first team to arrive at the after waiting for another half hour. It was completely dark, and surprisingly, no one had come. It shouldn't be, even if the cadets haven't arrived yet, the squad leaders and the main instructor should be here. The group then sensed that something was wrong, and resumed unfolding the map. And the 5 heads came together to look at it again and again, and Daniel was a veteran of the outdoors, and he was still relatively confident in his abilities, so he couldn't even believe that there was a chance that they were going the wrong way to the wrong place, and he resumed his calculations as a few of the others weren't idle either, their minds racing with is it this place or not? What went wrong? At the same moment, Michael raised his left hand and looked at the watch on his wrist. It was already 7:40 p.m. However, there were still teams that hadn't arrived, and to add to his concern, Ivy hadn't arrived either. He'd given them absolutely plenty of time, and if they strictly followed the coordinates given on the map and traveled at a normal speed, all of the teams would have arrived an hour ahead of the allotted time. Michael asked Ethan which teams hadn't arrived yet. Ethan immediately reported to Michael that there were 2 more. And Ethan told Michael who was leading each of the 2 teams. And what members they had. Michael frowned, looking to see where their coordinates were now. Ethan was about to go look when another team of 5 men came along in a state of disarray. From a distance, Michael scrutinized all 5 of those people, without Ivy, and his frown grew deeper and deeper. That's also when Ethan found out the coordinates of Daniel's group and reported them to Michael. Michael's face was as grim as water, and he didn't know what those 5 people had done to get themselves into that place either. He made a decision at once. Jack, you go with me to find the men, and Ethan, Oliver, you take the others and camp here. They's over yonder on the hill. Daniel and Ivy exclaimed, almost at the same time, that the Ivy said to the group, pointing to the mountains in the distance, over there. It should be that way. The Daniel looked guiltily to the crowd around him. I was the one who miscalculated a coordinate point. The others were somewhat dismayed. After all, they had never doubted Daniel's ability, and from the beginning had given him the map in his charge. The Sumian atmospherically waved his hand. Also blame the few of us are thinking of relying on you. Even do not look at the map. Having found the problem, all they had to do next was to head in the right direction. They needed to go back up the valley the way they came. Then up another opening in the valley to another mountain. They had been walking during the day, and now they had to go down and then up a hill, which was certainly a great test of their strength. The crowd hadn't even started walking back when Michael's voice came over the intercom. Daniel was carrying. Daniel, who was already weak, was even more startled to hear Michael's voice and to think that he might be here to raise hell. Michael first determined with Daniel where they were to make sure there were no errors in the information coming from the GPS. Then Michael, with a commanding tone, came to the ears of the crowd. Now on my command, do not go down the hill, 45 degrees north, first 5 kilometers. The road Michael was talking about would have saved them about 2/3 of the time it would have taken. According to Daniel's squad leader, Oliver, who reported that Daniel had shown great talent in the subject of using military maps, Michael wondered where they had been negligent as a team, but given Daniel's past outstanding performance, Michael had dared to tell him about the route. That it would have been safer to let them go back the way they came if they had been led by another man. But to go back the way they came would have involved too much walking and too much time, and would have been a real test of their strength, and as long as Daniel did what he said, and didn't play with his own creations, they should have been able to get to the spot where they were set to make camp in less than 2 hours. Meanwhile, Michael, with Jack in tow, had set out from the spot where he had camped, in search of Daniel and his party. Daniel had been in contact with Michael, who was really good at that, and had led the team over the mountains as Michael had said, and the team, who had been a little wary of the journey that was to follow, had been hearing uninterruptedly the commands that Michael had given them remotely, and with a pillar in their hearts they were not so demoralized. Michael watched the little red dot on the GPS get closer and closer to him and Jack, and half of his hanging heart dropped. He and Jack stood at the bottom of a 3-meter-high cliff. Waiting for the march after nightfall was actually easier than during the day, as the sun had set and the heat had receded, and it was autumn, but it wasn't quite cold, and barely pleasant enough to be considered. Having received a definite answer from Michael that in less than 2 hours they would be at the place where they had camped, the group walked with great vigor, and the trainees are well aware of Michael's ability, so they trust Michael, and if they do what he says, they can't go wrong. But as we walked, there was no road ahead. Daniel immediately reported over the intercom, Michael, there's no road ahead. There must be nothing wrong with the line. Michael told him. He must have gotten confused again somewhere and brought the crowd to the pit. Michael laughed softly at Daniel's nervous tone, and hummed into his walkie-talkie. The crowd was dumbfounded. Well, what does that mean? Jump down. I'll meet you down there. Jump. The crowd was even more dumbfounded. Michael wasn't teasing them, I'm afraid. Daniel was the only one who ran up quickly, not knowing what he saw, and he turned around in surprise, yelling to those behind him, come here, come here. The others, hearing such a cry from Daniel, ran up to see that it's true that there's no road ahead, but it's not a cliff, it's just a 3-meter-high cliff on one side, so jumping off won't kill you, you'll get hurt at best. The 2 men, Michael and Jack, stood pensively at the foot of the bluff, waiting for them. Michael looked at Daniel's eyes more praise. He did not have to think about it to know that all the people in this team think that Daniel will read the map, threw the map to Daniel on the head to follow Daniel to cause such a mistake. But after such a problem arose, there was no disagreement or conflict in their group. And Daniel handled the situation so well that it was only with his assistance that they were finally able to find the correct route of travel. So Michael wasn't going to penalize them for this. Team Michael yelled at them from the bottom of the bluff, "Jump down," and squad leader Jack and I will catch you from below. The Daniel had been in similar situations before when he was doing outdoor sports, and there was always some treacherous road to travel, so he wasn't afraid, but a couple of the girls weren't so sure about that, and he and Anthony talked it over with. Anthony jumped first, he stayed at the end. And a couple of the girls were in the middle, so that with the first one, jumping, a couple of the girls wouldn't be so scared, and with someone left behind to pad the girls would feel safer, too. Anthony was scared to death in his heart, but after thinking about it all, he had no choice but to jump, and he kept reassuring himself that there was still Michael and squad leader down there. Michael was giving Anthony the gist of the jump out loud to reduce resistance and minimize the extent of the injury. That Anthony jumped with his heart in his mouth and was steadily caught by the Anthony. A big man touched so much that he almost cried out. I thought it was Michael, and opened his eyes to see that it was the class president of the next class, Jack, followed by Sophia, Sumi, and then Ivy. Seeing that one by one they had jumped, and with Jack's help none of them were hurt, the tension in Ivy's mind eased a lot. She even had the presence of mind to tease Michael down there. Michael, I'm going to jump. You're going to have to hold me. The first 3 people who jumped were caught by Jack, the junior squad leader, and she said this in an ambiguous way but under the circumstances, no one else in the room had the heart to think much about that. Michael lazily raises his eyes to Ivy as you jump. She's the only one who can joke about it, under the circumstances. The very moment Ivy leapt down, Jack rushed forward to catch it, and someone else beat him to it, stepping in front of him, arms outstretched ready to meet the petite figure that was falling so fast that Ivy slammed into Michael's chest from the top down, the sky spinning. They could hear each other's thumping heartbeats. Michael had his hands wrapped around Ivy so tightly he didn't even dare to let her feet hit the ground for fear of twisting them if she fell from the heights. They embraced each other like that for a few seconds before the two of them slowly parted, as if nothing had ever happened. Ivy thought that the pullout might actually change some things between them. The Chapter 6, we, of course, must meet. Turning to the last night of the pullout, over the past 3 days, we have experienced long-distance running with heavy loads, night raids, and finding the stationing place with respect to the coordinate points on the map, and no one has complained about it, but instead, we have become more united. The night was particularly silent in the mountains in the fall, and a campfire was lighted by the tents in the quarters, and the men sat in a group around the campfire was burning brightly, and the hearts of the group of cadets were relieved that the 3-day pullout is considered to be basically over, and a car will bring them back to the camp early tomorrow morning, and their military training, which is coming to an end, will be over. They will then return to the ministry and be assigned to different divisions, depending on their individual circumstances. They were sitting around a campfire casually chatting, and the 3 squad leaders also took off their usual seriousness and sat down with them. Now it seems that the class president, who usually yells at them fiercely, is only their age, perhaps even younger than them, and also loves to play and laugh and joke around. Michael, too, sat silently by the campfire, listening to them. The topic of conversation among the trainees suddenly came down to Ivy.